All right, welcome to what will be our final installment of studies in the Gospel of Mark. Uh, this week we're going to be looking at the preparation for burial as well as the resurrection of Jesus, starting in Mark 15, verse 42. We are introduced to Joseph of Arimathea. He is mentioned in all four Gospels. And he is the one who asked for Jesus' body to prepare it for burial before the Sabbath. And we learn something from each of the Gospels concerning this. From Luke, we know that he was, as we knew from Mark as well, that he was a member of the Sanhedrin and that he was opposed to the charges against Jesus. We know that from Matthew uh, that he was wealthy and that it was his tomb that they were placing Jesus in. And that from John, Nicodemus also was with him. And Nicodemus is the one who Jesus saw in the middle of the night. And we also learn from this the passage in John that the tomb was in a garden. The two Marys, follow Joseph and see where Jesus' body was laid. This is going to be significant as it's just before the Sabbath. No work is done for the Sabbath, so in obedience to the Sabbath, the women did not do the final preparations for burial because we know that Joseph and Nicodemus had started that process. Um, so they would not have been able to do that. And the Jewish people measured days from sundown to sun up rather than the way we would do it today from sunrise to sunset. So the day actually started in the evening. So Sabbath would begin as darkness fell on the earth Friday night and would end as darkness fell on Saturday night. So they were unable during the Sabbath day to attend to Jesus' body, and so therefore they had to wait until early on what we would call Sunday morning. So the two Marys in Mark's account go with Salome. Now, each account in all of the Gospels is going to be somewhat different now. Very personal encounters with Jesus, different eyewitnesses, and so there are slightly different stories in each case, but the reason is because it's seen from different people's perspectives. They go very early to anoint Jesus' body, and as I said, after the Sabbath and at the first light of day, so as early as they could. You didn't want to go at night, but as soon as there was daylight, they went. And they were wondering how they were going to roll away the stone, but by the time they got there, uh, the stone is rolled away, and an angel tells them that Jesus is risen, and to go and tell the disciples and Peter he is going to see them in Galilee. He's going ahead to see them in Galilee. Adding Peter showed that they're very much concerned. The angel was concerned that Peter not be left out just because he had betrayed Jesus, a way to encourage him. So this is where the rest of Gospel of Mark is open to interpretation. Um, and I believe that these last verses were not actually part of Mark's gospel, and I'm going to put that at the very end as an excursus because it does not negate the fact of the resurrection. The women saw the angel. The angel said that Jesus had risen and that he was going to show himself to the disciples. Again, we will discuss the controversy in an excursus. But let's look at these final verses that, as they are in most of our Bibles. First of all, at least in the English translations that I'm aware of, there's a note before these verses that say this section was not likely part of the original Gospel of Mark, and I agree with that. But these verses were added to fill in the account because it left the story hanging. So from verses 9 to 11, we see that there are a very brief summary of John chapter 20, verses 1 to 18, and concern Jesus' encounter with Mary Magdalene. Again, we see that not only did the women witness Jesus' death, they were also the first to witness Jesus' resurrection. Jesus elevated the status of women. It also adds to the authenticity of the accounts, because if they were making it up, why would they have women be the witnesses? In Jesus' day, women could not actually be legal witnesses in a court of law. The next encounter is verses 12 and 13, and that's, again, likely a very brief summary of Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 45 on Emmaus Road, where the disciples are kept from recognizing Jesus until he breaks bread with them. Verse 14 is a sharp rebuke, not characteristic of Jesus and not found in any of the other Gospels. It was likely in response to what was happening in the church, where some people were doubting the resurrection. Verses 15 and 16 is, again, very much a summary, or apparently a summary of Matthew 28, verses 16 to 18, the Great Commission. And verses 17 to 20 very briefly touch on aspects of Acts, Pentecost, speaking in tongues, the ascension of Jesus, and Paul handling a snake and not dying. So it's likely that this was just a summary to fill in the rest of the story. Just one note, hopefully you're not familiar with these groups, but some very extreme Christian groups actually do handle snakes and drink poison because they are trying to apply these verses to their lives. I don't think that was the intent of the author by any means, to suggest that we should flout death by allowing ourselves to be poisoned by snakes, or drinking poison for that matter, but just reflected, the miracle of Paul, and likely a miracle that has been lost to history, of somebody who is maybe forced to take poison and survived. So we see here the culmination of the gospel. In last week's message, the centurion said, "Behold, this was the Son of God." And in the resurrection, we see this evidenced. In the resurrection, we see the culmination of the good news. It's good news that Jesus died for our sins. It's even better news that Jesus rose from the dead, because it's a confirmation to us that Jesus has indeed conquered death, and that we, being united with him in his death and resurrection, will also experience resurrection. And there are some modern and liberal interpretations that would say this is a figurative resurrection, but that is not the way any of the Gospels record it. Even Mark's partial Gospel here account show that the body was not there. Jesus rose physically from the grave. This is the miracle of the resurrection. This is the hope of the gospel, that the Messiah came not just to deliver us from our enemies, but far more profoundly, deliver us from our ultimate enemy, sin, and the ultimate consequence of sin, death. So this is something to rejoice. This is something to preach with enthusiasm, and thank you for joining us for this study. I do want to just, in closing, give the reasons why I believe that the longer ending of Mark is not part of the original gospel. And the longer ending of Mark is called the longer ending because there's also a shorter ending of Mark, and we will get to that in a few moments. There are three main possibilities in the longer ending of Mark discussion. One, the ending is authentic. Two, the ending is not authentic, and Mark meant to end the gospel in verse 8. And three, the long ending is not authentic, and the original ending of Mark was either lost or for some reason never able to be completed. And I think that the third option is correct. And here are some of the reasons why. And this is quite a detailed account. I'm leaving this at the end because I don't want anybody preaching on this. This is something that we know for information, but the typical person who is listening to our message doesn't need to be worried about these things. But it is good to know the reasoning why this gospel is often, this part of the gospel is considered having to be a later addition. Most versions, and there are thousands and thousands of fragments and versions of the New Testament in that have survived, dating from as early as 120 AD all the way up to the 11th century. So there's many, many different portions of Scripture that have survived, and they are looked at together when coming up with the Gospels, well, with the entire New Testament, in fact. And most of the versions that we have do have the longer ending of Mark, but most scholars doubt that it was part of the original because some of the earliest manuscripts don't have it. And we have evidence from early church history as well. Both Eusebius and Jerome, who were writing between 3 and 400 AD, said that the most reliable manuscripts of the time did not have the longer ending of Mark. So even back in the 300s, there's questions about the authenticity of this. At least one compiler, that was somebody who would take the versions that were available to them and make a single document, admitted to adding the longer ending because they determined and felt that even though many versions didn't have it at the time, the longer ending was part of the original. So we know that these decisions were made because it's recorded once that this happened. This was Victor of Antioch around 500 AD. There's another argument against the longer ending, and that is, in fact, the shorter ending. Some manuscripts have this as the shorter ending, but they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told, and after this, Jesus himself appeared to them and sent out by means of them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Now you can tell very easily just from reading that that's been an addition. But there are some versions of Mark that have this. This is called the shorter ending. But many of them have both the shorter ending followed by the longer ending. And the very fact that there is a shorter ending suggests that there was a problem and that people were trying to come up with a solution for the gospel ending the way it did. Uh, So that just further raises questions about this text. And finally, there is yet even another insertion into the longer ending, and this goes in between verses 14 and 15, and it says, and they, and I'm going to have to read this, and they excused themselves, saying, the age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the spirits, or does not allow what lies under the unclean spirits to understand the truth and power of God. Therefore, reveal your righteousness now, Thus they spoke to Christ, and Christ replied to them, "The term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled. By other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned, I was handed over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, in order that they may inherit spiritual and incorruptible glory of righteousness that is in heaven." And again, we see even clearer in this particular passage that it's undoubtedly in another insertion, but it's trying to address just the challenges that this longer ending introduced. There are even further evidences, and this goes to the style and vocabulary that are very different from the rest of Mark's gospel. One interesting point, and to me this is one of the strongest arguments against the longer ending, is found in verse 7, where the angel says that Jesus will see them in Galilee, but this does not occur in the longer ending. Jesus is not recorded as seeing them in Jerusalem, in Galilee at all, but that the post-resurrection appearances that they are highlighting in the longer ending are actually all taking place in Jerusalem. So why would the angel tell them that they're going to see them in Galilee when that never takes place? Finally, the break between verses 8 and 9 assumes the previous verse had Jesus as the subject rather than the women. And so that this probably isn't clear in the translations because they smooth it over. But that is the case. And then there's one other little interesting note, and that is that in verse 9, Mary Magdalene is introduced into the story as if it's the first time she's been mentioned, and yet she's been mentioned numerous times already in the Gospel of Mark, and so would not need to have that introduction that she had demons cast out of her. So if Mark had intended to end his Gospel with verse 8, why did he include verse 7? He is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. To me, this is the strongest argument for the shorter ending, against the shorter ending, that rather what we have here is the gospel with the last verses missing. The one argument in favor of the shorter ending is that it leaves the reader in a place of having to believe the testimony of the women. And they are afraid and they say nothing. And so some argue that this is exactly where the disciples of Mark's day were. They were facing persecution from the Romans. They had believed without seeing physically Jesus raised from the dead. And so if the shorter ending is accurate, the claim is that Mark is challenging the reader to go and speak the truth now. But again, I just don't understand why Mark would say he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, and then the story ends there. When the parallel passage in Matthew that is worded very closely, they do in fact go to Galilee, and Jesus does in fact meet them there. And the Gospel of Matthew concludes, of course, with the Great Commission, which is the culmination and the fulfillment of those words of the angel. So that's my argument for the original ending being lost, and the summary was being added later to complete the Gospel based on other New Testament passages. So I hope that's helpful, and thank you for joining us for this study.